Our real national debt is over 12 trillion. And people sometimes say, oh, that doesn't really count because, so-and-so person isn't dead, so we don't have to give them the money tomorrow. And that might be true when it comes to pensions. But somebody at some point has to pay for it. In order to have stuff that we want today, we're saddling our future generations with enormous debts and liabilities that are getting increasingly distant on the horizon in terms of being able to afford them. If you're able to reform tax, get economic growth going, start to get debt under control, things of this nature, then you can start to more confidently approach big subjects like reforming the NHS, like getting public sector pensions under control. I don't think you need to wait, really, in order to start reforming taxes. I think that's something that can happen as quickly as a politician or a leader or a chancellor deigns it to.
We good. All right. John, see ya.
Good to see you. How are you?
Well, as I said, people listening probably hear I'm quite croaky. I've had this chest infection for a couple of weeks. It's finally cleared. But I'm going to make you do the majority of the talking today because I'm croaky. But we can't keep putting off this interview because we have this tax burden that is growing and concerning people. Probably a good place to tell people what you guys do at the tax.
Yeah. The TaxPayers Alliance is a campaign group. We were founded in 2004, so we're 21 years old this year. 2004 was obviously a time when New Labour were particularly powerful. The first few years of the New Labour government, 97 to 2001, they actually largely stuck with conservative economic policies, and they were good years. The public finances were actually in surplus in 2001, which is the last time they have been, obviously. Deficits ever since. And then around the sort of 2003, 2004 mark, there was this political tension between Brown and Blair. Brown was obviously keen to take over at some point, but which meant that Blair politically sort of ceded a bit of control to Brown in the Treasury, and he started to go nuts on spending, really. You can really see it in the chart. Spending takes off around that kind of time, and there was no real proper political challenge to that because the Tories were weak in opposition, really. Felt they needed to go along with the consensus of the day. Labour was still popular. It was, the sheen was starting to come off after the Iraq War, obviously, but, reasonably popular. They won again in 2005. But it was around that mark where a couple of guys who were members of the Conservative Party, a guy called Matthew Elliott, who went on to run the Vote Leave campaign, but this was back when he was a 20-something, with a friend of his called Andrew Allen. They tore up their membership cards of the Conservative Party and set up a taxpayer group. They'd seen elsewhere in Europe and in America that there was a healthy space for a group that talks about low taxes in and of themselves being good things, and then the things that prevent that happening: high spending, wasteful spending, ballooning debts, deficits, all of this kind of stuff. And think tanks do a valuable job coming up with proper research and academic work and all of the rest of it, but there wasn't really that sustained campaign, which is what the TaxPayers Alliance really is at its heart and soul. It's a campaign group. Yes, we do lots of research and we have think tank quality research, really, but at its heart and soul, the TPA is a campaign group, and we still to this day take part in stunts and action days, and we go out on the ground. We're not just an SW1 group. In fact, we're deliberately not in many ways. We go out on the ground in council areas across the country, Newcastle, Leicester, Ipswich, whatever, because a lot of issues that matter to people happen right on their doorstep. Are there bins being collected? Are the potholes being filled? Did the street lights work? All of this stuff really matters to people. And they also, while they have a good sense of what Britain needs in terms of the economy, massive numbers like the national debt don't really register with people, and nor should they in many senses. What's £1 trillion? So it's very hard to conceptualize. But if a local council wastes, say, 200 grand, that could be the value of their house. That number they get. So, campaigning on those, sometimes people call them small fry issues, which I object to quite profoundly. They're issues that matter to people, and how that places within the culture of how politicians and bureaucrats treat taxpayers' money. I think it's important, and wasteful spending, of course, erodes trust in public institutions as well. So there's all these elements that created the backdrop for forming a taxpayer group, and I would say it, but we've been reasonably successful ever since. The group really got its first big splash in 2006 in the Sun newspaper, and the two founders at the time, they sat on the floor and they were cutting out clippings of different wasteful spending stories, and they just added them all up, stuck them into a spreadsheet, added up all the numbers, and it was a big number of wasteful spending, and it landed, I think it was on page 2 of the Sun newspaper, and that sort of gave them their calling card. They could say, we've made a splash, and the group started to expand, started to receive more donations, and it's really kicked on from there. It came to prominence again in the MP's expenses scandal of 2009, unsurprisingly. And then the journey of the organisation has been quite interesting, because then you get to sort of around the coalition era, 2012, and because we complain a hell of a lot about taxes, too high, we need low taxes. And then we were starting to be taken quite seriously as an organisation at that point, Conservative-led government, all this kind of stuff. And the challenge behind the scenes was you moan a lot, but what do you actually think the country ought to look like, what the tax system should look like? So in 2012, we undertook a big project. We put together a big report that took 18 months to put together. We put together a commission, lots of economists and tax policy experts on what we think the tax system should look like. That report was called The Single Income Tax, and in its essence, it's about taxing flows of income once and once only. So if you keep money within a company and reinvest it and don't take it out, you don't tax it. And if you distribute the money either as pay or dividends or whatever, then at that point it's taxed, and it's only taxed once. So the system would completely scrap things like inheritance tax, transaction taxes like stamp duty, land tax, and other things like that, air passenger duty, and all these other kind of things that gum up economic activity. So it's really just keeping things simple as well. And that's the essence of tax reform, I think, is to simplify the tax system. And there's several reasons why that's important and a good thing, which is it's good for economic growth, simple taxes, more investment, all of that good stuff. But it's transparent as well. And it means that people feel that they have trust that other people are playing by the rules. I think complicated tax systems create so many carve-outs and loopholes that maybe are put in with good intentions by politicians, but people just get a sense of, I pay my taxes. Why do big companies get to sit down with HMRC and negotiate their own tax deal when I don't? There's that sense of not a level playing field anyway. So,
well, I feel like we're at a rough time as a country at the moment. I think there was a poll even came out today, but it feels like everything is breaking in the country. It doesn't matter where you look. It could be the NHS, it could be schools, it could be just every part of the country seems to be breaking. We have endless videos on social media of people just walking into Greggs or Tesco's and stealing things. We have scandal after scandal, yet the tax burden's got higher. It's got a lot higher. And I feel like, especially with what happened with, say, the inheritance tax on farmers, we've gone from a place where I think government should treat the tax they take as a privilege and something they should use wisely, to now almost like we're serfs and everything we earn is theirs and we get to keep what they allow us to keep. And I can't understand how the government is taxing so much and delivering so little now. And we're obviously at a breaking point, across the economy. And I don't know how we've got to this point.
Yeah, you're right. There's so much in there. So the idea that it belongs to the Treasury and they just deign to give you some back, that's even in the media narrative around the budget. When the budget's on and Chancellor stands up and, they call it giveaways. When she doesn't raise taxes by as much as they thought, or she might even cut tax, they say, it's a giveaway. Hang on a minute, who does the money belong to? You're not giving it away. You're taking less of it from the people who earned it in the first place. So I think that the language around how we talk about the public finances really needs to shift, so there's much more respect for taxpayers. Absolutely. But I think tax burden going up and up and spending increasing, I don't think it's necessarily, counterintuitively almost, it's not a surprise that public services don't get any better, because when you just fling more money at something, you're not fixing the fundamental problem to start with. So the NHS is a good example. It's completely broken as a system. We seem to have this almost religious veneration for it, but it's not treating sick people as well as it ought to, and if we gave it 100 billion more tomorrow, I don't think it would perform that much better than it currently does. I don't think money's the issue. It's about reforming the system. So actually, the idea that we just keep taking money off people who are generating jobs and growth in the real economy to chuck into broken public services is a completely busted model. You're right. There's lots of reasons why people are leaving or choosing to leave the country. Tax is one of them, but it's also some of the stuff you were talking about as public services being on their knees. It's crime, right? I know a couple of people who've moved to Dubai and it's like, oh yeah, the tax system's really great. And it's like, not really worried about that actually. It's just the fact that I can walk on the street at night wearing a watch and not be, threatened with a machete or whatever else, So it's not just about the level of taxation, but it's funny. We can't just keep chucking more and more money at these services and expect them to be fixed. And it also poses some very big questions. What does the government do? Why is it doing it? And how does it, perform that function better? The government does far too much. The 2015 Conservative Manifesto, right? You open it up. One of the first phrases you see is, "We have a plan for every stage of your life." It actually said that inside.
It's kind of creepy.
It is a bit, isn't it? And I think I'd rather you didn't have a plan for every stage of my life as it goes. So there is that mindset that, and I think it's been accentuated by COVID as well, but this idea that something must be done. If there's a problem, then the government has to fix it, right? You see it all the way down to the level of, the government are spending money on toothbrush coordinators to go in and teach kids how to brush their teeth. And you're like, this is kind of what should happen at home. There's this idea that, kids' dentistry is bad. Okay, we need to fix it with more taxpayers' money. And, if you get into a situation where the government thinks it needs to solve every single problem in every person's life, it will never be able to achieve that. So it's a little wonder that public services are busted with the tax burden increasing, even though that sounds counterintuitive almost.
Yeah, you talked about tax reform and the need for tax reform. It feels like the reform that's required is actually political reform. We need reform of government. We've allowed government to get too big, too bloated, to the point whereby the tax burden is so high that we're unable to do things as individuals. I know across friendship groups, people are feeling particularly squeezed at the moment with the cost of living and high taxation. But also as business owners or operators, it's very hard these days to build businesses. The one tax that I hate more than anything is the business rate. The business rate is a block to creating jobs in a local economy. It stops people actually having the ability to go and just open up a business in their town centre. But I don't even know where do we start, because government's just got so big. As we come to whatever Rachel Reeves' next budget is, I know they're going to be considering, how do we borrow more? How do we tax more? But I think we're already on our knees with this.
We are. The tax burden's getting up towards 38% of GDP.
Is there, what was it highest?
It's getting up towards its post-war record.
Okay.
By the end of the parliament, certainly it will be at its post-war record, or at least 80-year high, I think. But anyway, 38% of GDP is enormous. We recommended in our 2012 report, and sort of stick by that as a guiding principle, that the government should raise and spend around a third of GDP. £1 in every three sounds about reasonable for a modern social democracy. Whether one wants a social democracy or not, we have one. So £1 in every three. We're at 38%. It's enormous. And you can see the challenge that the Chancellor has in trying to meet all of these ridiculous objectives that they have. That they went into the election pledging not to raise income tax, VAT, national insurance, and then they were told by the Treasury, actually, you do need to raise money. So they went away and said, okay, well, let's raise employers' national insurance and have a little bit of a weasel out on that, on the original pledge on national insurance,
which we all know is a tax on people anyway.
Yeah,
every business tax is a tax on people.
Yeah, they should call it what it is. It's a second income tax, and employers' national insurance is a jobs tax. Anybody that runs a business, and we're seeing it now in the real economy with people not hiring when they would have hired otherwise, not giving pay rises, or at least not as generous as they might otherwise have done because of employers' national insurance increases.
Or raising their prices because they have to cover their costs.
tax is paid by people. This is another thing that they need to understand, that there is no, a toaster doesn't pay the electricity levies, your TV doesn't pay the TV license, you pay it. Somebody pays tax. And when we talk about taxes on business, as if it's some sort of entity that's able to produce tax receipts, tax is paid for by people in higher prices, lower wages or lower returns to capital. So, if you've invested in a company, you get less back, which discourages investment. So people pay taxes, and that's a very important concept that doesn't seem to be appreciated in the broader debate. But going back to what you were originally talking about, where do we even start with this? I think there's a whole culture change needed, a mindset shift.
Well, I don't think many people understand basic economics, and why should they? I mean, these are complicated subjects, but I think we've seen Gary Economics get quite a platform recently, and I actually agree. I think he's identified the problem well, that there is this widening wealth gap, that this system has benefited the richest in society. We have managed to extract value from those who need it most to those who don't need it, but he comes out with quite an impassioned solution, which is just to tax the wealthy more without any real practical understanding what that means. But firstly, you won't raise enough and people will leave.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines, the world's most responsible currency, the right way. Because the future depends on it.
Yeah, wealth taxes don't work. Even in the 1970s, a bit of an economic nadir, like the Chancellor at the time, Dennis Healey, said, I couldn't find a way to make a wealth tax worth the money that it was going to raise because people leave. You had famous examples in the 70s, Rolling Stones, whoever else, they were, all heading off to different countries because of high taxes. Back then, marginal rates sometimes were over 100%, so could be even worse. But wealth taxes do not work. There are more countries junking wealth taxes than there are implementing them. There aren't that many countries now with a genuine wealth tax. Countries like Sweden got rid of their inheritance tax. Norway tried to implement a wealth tax and loads of people left. In Spain, you also had a situation where a regional government was suing the national government over a wealth tax because they were worried people were going to leave. People with capital are much more mobile than people without. That's just a fact. You have to deal with that fact.
But despite all these facts, his message is very popular. Yeah,
because it's easy. It's easy. It's intuitive. It's like, well, they've got money and I haven't, so take some from them and give it to me. And it assumes it's a zero-sum way of thinking. Somebody wins and somebody loses, and the economic pie is of a fixed size, and we all just get a different chunk of it, depending on how it's carved up. But actually, proper policies that encourage economic growth means that the pie gets bigger. And people who invest and create jobs leads to higher employment. We get people off welfare. All of that sort of virtuous stuff starts to happen. And it's really interesting because this attitude to wealth in general is I find quite fascinating. That you can talk about inequality and all the rest of it, but when pop stars or footballers or famous actors do well and they're posting on Instagram with their lifestyles, everyone seems to think that's all right. But when it's a business person who's actually created jobs and opportunities for other people, for families to get on in the world, that they're sort of deemed as evil. It's a very strange dynamic that we have when it comes to wealth. But
we not only do we demonize them, we demonize them while wanting to take money from them.
Well, exactly.
So we're criticizing them, we're attacking them, and then just trying to say, give us more of your money.
Yeah.
It's a really skewed way of thinking.
Yeah, and the top 1% of earners pay 28% of the income tax in the UK. If people leave, we will have less money for the public services that we've been talking about, which are on their knees. So we have to deal with those realities. We also have to sort of flip the conversation to talk about the positivity of what business people do. You know, outside of the M25, forget London for a minute. It's sort of a very unique case. A wonderful place, but a unique case. Go outside of London, talk to the cafes, the hairdressers, the pubs, the butchers. Talk to them about business rates. Talk to them about employers' national insurance and what it's done to their businesses, what it's done to their hiring plans for next year, their growth plans. They might want to take an empty unit down the road. They're not going to now. So go out into the real economy and talk to people, and you can see that the very, very profound impact of turning the dial up on tax in the way that we are. And there's a mindset in the Treasury and in the conversation more generally that we just have to spend the amount of money that we currently spend. So we just need to find a way to pay for it and, shrug our shoulders and say taxes have to go up. But nobody's really addressing the first question of why are we spending that much in the first place? What does it go on? Why can't we spend it more efficiently? And what are the government's priorities? For instance, the world's becoming slightly less secure. Do we need to spend more money on defence? Probably. But then what are the trade-offs? What should we spend less on? Nobody really sort of says that. It's just spend more, tax more, and you don't really get that proper conversation about trade-offs.
Well, to me, it's very obvious that something's wrong. The tax burden's too high. It is strangling society. Not only is the tax burden too high, but they're borrowing too much, which is driving inflation, which is, is accelerating the problem. I mean, I've just seen in the last week or so a couple of examples of shrinkflation, which to me, I always think of really sinister examples of what's going wrong. You know, little fridge milkshakes.
Yeah,
it used to be 500 ml when I as a kid, used to drink it, and I remember a few years ago it became 400 ml. Now it's like 330 ml. These tiny little bottles. And I was in Tesco the other day and I was at the Krispy Kreme counter. I didn't buy any, but the donuts are tiny now. And these, to me, I've been out to Venezuela. I've seen shrinkflation. These are sinister examples of where things are going wrong. But I look at it and I think, I've run companies. I've run a football team. My football team, I want the best manager for the job so we can win promotions. My companies, I want the best managers to make sure we make a profit. But I look at government and I think, are we putting the best people in place to make these decisions for the country? And it appears not. It appears we're putting morons in charge of the most important decisions for our country, and everyone is feeling the consequences of this.
Yeah, and there's a debate about how to attract more talented people into government, whether it's in the civil service or into elected politics. And the question comes around about pay. How much do you pay them? MPs are currently on about 92,000, I think.
Yeah, I'd pay them like $500,000.
Yeah, but then, there's an interesting question there. What's the incentive structure? What's the incentive framework? We've recommended that MPs can get paid more if we tie their pay to growth in GDP per capita. So if
like a company.
Yeah, so if everybody's getting richer, then MPs can do better. If you change the incentive structure, you might see better results. So I and my organisation that I run, the TPA, we're not against higher pay per se. For extremely talented individuals to go into elected politics or indeed the civil service. But as it's currently constructed, it just seems to me that pay would go up, but performance wouldn't improve. So these small, dynamic, high-performing teams in the civil service delivering stuff. During COVID, they rolled out the vaccine. Arguments aside about the response to COVID, but just the task of rolling out the vaccine, they did it really well. And there was a reason they did it well, because the government at the time got rid of lots of regulations and procurement rules that normally hold things back. They said, right, you're operating under streamlined processes, go for it. And they got it done. So if government was like that all of the time in all the different facets of government, pay people more, absolutely. But you see, and you get these really interesting comparisons, right? I can't remember if it was the Home Office or the Ministry of Defence, but they advertised recently for, I think it was a head of cybersecurity, and the job was going for something like 55k. And you look at some of the roles in the NHS for diversity, equity and inclusion officers at 90-something thousand, 100,000 plus for some of these roles. And what the hell is going on there? Paid the head of cybersecurity at the Home Office 10 times that, surely, to get somebody of decent caliber in a very complicated world dealing with serious issues at the Home Office. But that kind of skewing of priorities means that I would like to see incentives and structures reformed before they start jacking pay up, because I just feel like at present they jack pay up and we just have exactly the same situation we do now, just more expensive.
Yeah, I feel like we're at that moment in time now where we need something drastic to change. The direction of the economy is very clear. It's not good. The OBR keeps revising their forecasts. As we know, taxation keeps going up, borrowing keeps going up, and I can't see any signals or evidence that things would turn in a corner. If anything, I see more like terminal decline.
Yeah, drastic action is needed. You're absolutely right. And I think that whoever comes into government in 2029, I'm not convinced that this current government would necessarily undertake some of the things I'm about to talk about. But, there needs to be, it's been spoken about a lot on social media and elsewhere, but sort of a repeal act. They need to go in, they need to get rid of the Equality Act 2010, Climate Change Act 2008, the Human Rights Act. They need to get rid of quite big pieces of legislation.
Why?
Because look at pay. We were just talking about pay. The Equality Act has led to a situation in Birmingham Council where the council went bankrupt because they were taken to court over their decision to pay people doing different jobs, different wages. That was appealed. The council lost. A union-led case won, which means now that judges are setting pay based on the Equality Act 2010 rather than.
There are examples of jobs here where they're trying to pay the same.
Oh, sorry.
So, what are the examples here of the jobs where they're trying to have equal pay?
It was about whether people working. It was a lot of it was to do with whether women were being paid the same as men, but of course men were probably doing different jobs, and it's underlying why Birmingham went bankrupt. They had to pay a 750 million back payment bill. When we've got judges setting pay, that is a very dangerous position to be in, and they're doing it based on legislation like the Equality Act. You've got public sector equality duties, which run through every single decision-making process that the government makes. So instead of making decisions based on, speed and whether it's the right thing to do economically or, for it being efficient, they have to do impact assessments on how it will affect different measures of equality under the public sector equality duties. So all of these things gum up government. And so therefore, in order to get stuff done, you need to get rid of the bad legislation. Governments come in with big programs and it's usually about enacting more legislation. That's fine, but they'd also need to get rid of a whole raft of bad legislation as well to make sure that government can operate much more efficiently.
It doesn't feel like something a Labour government could do.
Then again, they've got a big majority. So if anyone was going to do it, it would be a government with a big majority because you need to be able to push through and get stuff done.
But these sound very conservative ideas for a Labour government.
Possibly and probably. If we're being totally honest, I don't see them getting rid of the Equality Act, given they brought it in last time they were in government. And a lot of these things, it's really interesting because I think they're simple. They're difficult, but they're simple. Simple is not the same as easy. But I think a lot of the challenges that we face in the world, whether it's what Trump's doing on tariffs and trade and all this kind of stuff, whether we need to spend more on defense, economic growth, taxes, all the rest of it. A lot of it boils down to just getting our own house in order, so that's the cost of energy. Our energy costs are, for industrial use, 4 times that of America. That's because of decisions we've taken ourselves. Our tax system is burdensome and complicated. We need to cut and simplify taxes. Regulations, we have far too many regulations. A lot of these things always come back to the same answer. Get your own house in order, and then you can meet the broader challenges in a much more complicated global economy. And as I say, they're simple. You could write them out in an essay, and people could go, yeah, we should do all of that. But they're difficult, right? So
difficult politically,
which takes backbone. It takes courage. The idea. The previous Conservative government came in with a big majority themselves, but they couldn't get a lot of stuff done because of deference to the civil service, because of being tied up by bad law. Which, you can't get infrastructure done because of judicial review. Everything is gummed up in the system, and it leads to decline and stagnation, which is where we are now.
So what's at risk here? And how desperate would you say the situation is if you had to really kind of set the scene for where the country is at the moment?
I think it's analogous to the 1970s, actually. Not entirely, but with some echoes. I think things will probably get worse before they get better. And I think things probably need to get worse before they get better, which is a horrible thing to say because it means something to people's pockets.
You need to feel the real pain. Yeah,
before politicians decide to actually grip the situation and do something about it. 1979, a Conservative government came in under Margaret Thatcher and started a big program of trying to change things. The big problem then, of course, was the strong grip of union power, and that was the big economic challenge of the day.
Sorry, how bad were things in the 70s?
Pretty bad. We went to the IMF for a bailout. For a country that was a global superpower only a few decades before, it was embarrassing to say the least.
Connor's just got up the chart. So tax as a percent of GDP, what was that in 1970, Con? So we're 39.5%.
Yeah, we're going up back up towards 1960s levels.
So where did we get to in 1990?
It would have been low 30s, I think. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
But that low 30 to high 30 is a huge swing in real terms.
It's massive. It's absolutely enormous. It's going up by, if you're adding 8 percentage points of GDP to the tax burden, that's absolutely enormous. And then, you can talk about or look at different ways of viewing the tax system, whether what it's there to do, right? So you've got different academic views of this, the welfare maximizing rate of tax, the growth maximizing rate of tax, or the revenue maximizing rate of tax. And growth maximizing tax burdens tend to be in the low 20s.
Okay.
According to the academic literature. Welfare maximizing sort of more in the 30s. So more advanced social democracies with welfare systems and all of the rest of it. So the idea that we, and there's consensus across all the parties. Labour Party talk about growth all the time as their central mission and their big focus, and other management consultant-y kind of words that they use. But growth seems to be a central thing for them too. But they're not particularly willing to do the things necessary to get economic growth. I think it was 0.5% GDP growth the other day was announced, and it was talked about as if it was good news. We need to be clocking up rates of 2%, more than 2% annually, just to keep pace with the population growth and all of these kind of things. And
I had Shankar Singham in here. He's a great guy. He said growth is fairly easy to achieve. It's not a complicated thing to do. You have to reduce the tax burden and reduce the regulation burden. Those two things alone can drive massive amounts of growth. And if the government wants growth, Rachel Reeves is having a very tough time. I think Keir Starmer's having a particularly tough time. There are economists out there who are saying to them right now, you can do these 2-3 simple things and we'll drive massive growth. Yet they're not doing it. And I don't understand why it is they aren't doing these things.
Shankar was right, and as I mentioned, a lot of these things are very simple. You could get growth going pretty quickly with some very easy tweaks. I suppose there's two problems, particularly for a Labour government. One is that they perhaps don't want to be seen to be cutting taxes on businesses. For their core audience or whatever you want to call it, it might not be the best message. The other is the mindset of the Treasury itself. We've had this.
Is the Treasury a problem itself?
I think it is, yeah. And you always have to caveat. The politicians always have to caveat this. There's some wonderful people that work there. I'm sure that's true. Brilliant minds, straight out of Oxbridge, all that kind of stuff. But there's a mindset in the Treasury that focuses on next year's tax receipts. right? So it's all about, it's known as static modeling. If you tweak a tax, what does it mean for next year's revenue? What we need to be talking about are dynamic effects of taxation. So if you change a tax, what does it mean for growth, for jobs, for productivity? Not next year, not 5 years, in 10 years. What's the long-term picture? Because if you over-focus on next year's revenues, you leave yourself in a situation where you get all these distribution charts and, we found one person who's going to be worse off from this tax, so we can't do it, that kind of thing. Whereas if you're looking at a 10-year horizon and what it means for growth and jobs and business opportunities, you get a much rosier picture. Actually, when you're looking at, we've produced a dynamic tax model ourselves where you can, plug in tax changes and it shows you what happens to growth, jobs, or at least forecasts what happens to growth and jobs over a 10-year horizon. So that mindset needs to be, spread throughout the Treasury rather than this 1 year static mindset of what happens to next year's revenues. Now, in its defense, the Office for Budget Responsibility have started to incorporate some of those changes. So we'd love to see much more of that. But, the idea that the Treasury gum things up, I'm afraid is, to a large extent true. Yeah.
Very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with CASA.
So the Treasury itself needs reform.
I'd say break it up. I think it's far too powerful. It has a hold over every single government department, over an incoming government's strategic objectives. Whether that's a left-wing or a more conservative government, the Treasury has a stranglehold over every single one of them. And it goes back to that root problem of everyday man, everyday woman on the street saying nothing ever changes. Of course it doesn't, because we've got this behemoth at the Treasury that stops anything from happening. I'd break it up. You'd need a much more, this has been discussed a lot, so I won't claim this as an original idea, but a much stronger department for the Prime Minister, breaking up the Treasury. So, some suggestions that a unit would focus on economic growth. But yeah, it's far too powerful. Several governments over successive decades have reflected on the Treasury being too powerful and have said the same thing. So it is a block on economic growth.
It's kind of interesting because I had Liz Truss in here, and I've interviewed her a couple of times now. I've read her book, and I think she identified the problem. I think she knew what the problem was, both in terms of taxation, the tax burden, borrowing and trying to drive growth. And obviously she tried to move very quickly, and the gilt market wasn't particularly happy about it. But I think in reflection, she was correct in what she identified as a problem. And she's talked a lot about the problems with the Treasury. It feels like, unfortunately, whichever government comes into power, they don't actually have full control over the departments that are running the country, this civil service part that creates this block for what government needs to actually do.
The 23 permanent secretaries, which are the civil servants who run particular government departments, they really run the country. Separate.
With what mandate?
Well, quite. And we have this grand notion that we've got cabinet-led government in this country. It's not really particularly true on a day-to-day basis at all. They really run the country. So the diagnosis of the problem, is about spot on. We're taxing too much. The deep state, or however you want to phrase it, they do really run the country. And I think people get fed up of, if they've sort of had enough of the Tories and they want Labour in, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter.
Nothing changes.
Nothing changes. And people get despondent with politics and what's the point? And, they're all the same. You hear all these things all the time, and it's not just, people have a deep sense that something's broken. People aren't stupid.
I think they have a visceral sense now.
Yeah. The British public are pretty spot on. Their nose is pretty good for almost everything. They might not know the details, but their nose is good on all of these subjects. And they know that something's broken and needs fixing. So it will take a massive reorganization of the state, of how it operates, making it much leaner, and go back to some of the stuff, smaller teams, high performance, all of this kind of stuff. But that is difficult to do. There's centuries of tradition and convention built up here.
Also, what do you cut? It's often a great first question is, we have a huge government that's spending a huge amount of money on all kinds of things. If you're going to, like, reform have made a lot of progress, but a very obvious question is, what are you going to cut? Where do we cut? Where's the huge amount of waste? Where's the big easy ticket items where you can cut tens of billions out of spend, so you can reduce the tax burden? Have you guys looked at that?
Yeah. We, following on from our 2012 project, we followed up in 2015 with a similar scale and scope project on spending called the Spending Plan. A lot of our work looks at wasteful spending, which are the sort of day-to-day, £1 million here, 200,000 there. To really make a splash on spending, you have to tackle one or more of welfare, healthcare, pensions,
okay,
and entitlements.
What percentage of our? I mean, the NHS is about 20%. Is it 22%? Do you remember that OBR chart that we have where it breaks down government spend, the 1.1 trillion? Always blows my mind.
It's mostly the biggest proportion is welfare and pensions. Healthcare, we probably spend about 140 of, say, 1.2 trillion. So it's probably more like a 10%.
Is it 10? I thought it was higher.
It might be slightly higher now. Maybe it is.
Well, the one that gets me is debt interest.
Debt interest is now over 100 billion.
Yes,
so it dwarfs
10%.
Lots of government departments.
It's basically 10% of the budget.
25% of our debt is tied up, is index linked. So, it used to be much lower. In the 1980s, I think it was around 10%. So what that means is that shifts in interest rates and other global shocks have big impacts on what we pay on debt interest.
Is there anything we can do on debt interest to shift it and reduce the burden, or is it just we need more growth?
Grow.
Yeah.
Go above 2-3% of growth, and debt becomes less of an issue. It just it's as a percent of GDP, it starts to tumble, so it becomes much more manageable. Growth is the answer to almost everything, and politicians seem to get it. Again, the Labour government have made it their central mission. But when you get growth, you can manage these problems a lot more effectively. When you're scrambling around for good news on 0.5% growth, I even saw, it was last month or the month before, the GDP growth of 0.1%. Announced by the Office for National Statistics, and the political journalists were saying this is good news for the Chancellor. You're like, what kind of good news is that? And I think that's also a problem. Sorry to
please go.
ramble, but you get this sense that everything's framed politically. Oh, this is good news. Or give her a good news story. 0.1% GDP growth is measly, and it means more miserable lives for millions of people. This stuff matters. It's not political gossip. It's not a parlor game. So, framing everything through that lens of, this is good news on the doorstep for the Chancellor is rubbish, absolute rubbish.
I'll give you just one example. We've just opened, I've talked about it on the podcast a lot, we've opened a little cafe where we live in Bedford on the high street. Cost about 120 grand to refurb, get it ready, some money in for cash flow. But we have business rates of 16,500 a year, which we can't get away from. We've got new minimum wage requirements, but we have to provide holiday within that as well. So we've actually just provided a higher rate to pay people. We have that we can't reclaim on most of the things we buy, but we have to charge on the things we sell. So this is a hard business. We've created 2 full-time jobs and maybe 6 or 7 part-time jobs, but we've created that. Yeah. This is a hard business, a very hard business. And the reason it's hard is regulation and taxation. Mm-hmm. They're the 2 hardest parts. If you strip those away, this is a good business. It's a profitable business. I would probably open 2 or 3 more businesses like this in the town centre, but I can't because I'm so focused on just trying to get over the bureaucracy and taxation hurdle to make this one work. Mm-hmm. But I know intuitively I can create more businesses and more jobs with a reduction on that tax burden on that town centre where I live in.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's so obvious. But I don't understand why government isn't seeing this and seeing how hard it is to create a business and trying to make it easier.
Yeah. My dad was a publican.
There you go.
So growing up in that business was all the parallels are the same, and high energy costs, right?
Yeah, very high.
So for a cafe or a pub that has heating, lighting, cookers going all the time or whatever else it is, the energy costs are extraordinary, on top of the tax, on top of the reg, on top of the council interfering in everything, such as what you're doing with your car park and all of this kind of stuff. It just, why would anyone want to set up a business now? It's a terrible position that we've put ourselves in. But you're dead right.
Want to start businesses
because they're entrepreneurial. And something like a cafe or a pub, it's not just a money making machine. It's a place for people to go, and it's social, and it sort of brings a town alive, and it means something to people. Gets them out of their home, and all of these wonderful things. The straight answer is the Treasury mindset. They need more money for next year's spending. So
the little business.
Sod your business. I don't care if you open two more, or I'm not interested in the incentive structure for you to open two more. We just need more money for next year's spending. That is what it boils down to, and it's it's worse than just economic bad news. It's profoundly sad for people like you, or people who want to patronize your business, come and have a coffee and talk to their friends and do whatever. What it does to the social fabric of the country is just as important as the economic downsides.
Well, let's talk about these big ticket items. Attack whichever one you want first: pensions, the NHS, welfare. Where is the big quick wins that you've identified?
Quick wins,
or
difficult.
What
really
is
difficult.
The big reform that needs to happen?
Yeah. So one of the quite easy wins, I think, would be to remove things like social housing and welfare for recent immigrants. I think, when we're seeing people jump housing queues, having access to social housing, having access to welfare that working people have to pay for, I think they're going to be quite quick and easy wins. Pensions is again simple but difficult. You've got a situation where our real national debt is around 100% of GDP. I think it's about 2.9 trillion, our national debt. However, that is not all of our liabilities. We have unfunded public sector pension liabilities of another 3 trillion. We've got the state pension liabilities, I think, are approaching somewhere around 5 trillion. So actually, to boil it down,
scary.
Yeah, our real national debt is over 12 trillion.
Jesus Christ.
And people sometimes say, that doesn't really count because, like so-and-so person isn't dead, so we don't have to give them the money tomorrow. And that might be true when it comes to pensions, but somebody at some point has to pay for it. So it might not be me or you today. It might be our children, or it might be their children. This is what we're, in order to have stuff that we want today, we're saddling our future generations with enormous debts and liabilities that are getting increasingly distant on the horizon in terms of being able to afford them. So reforming public sector pensions will become a necessity. Again, very difficult because of unions.
Are there proposals for this?
Well, the coalition government did some pretty decent reforms to public sector pensions. Obviously didn't go far enough, but you quite easily shift them to from defined benefit to defined contribution. So what you essentially tie it much more to what somebody pays into it, and the generosity of employer contributions in the public sector is something that don't exist anymore in the private sector. These schemes used to exist in the private sector.
My dad had one.
Right? Because people would work till they were 60, probably wouldn't live that much longer after that. So the numbers made sense. They don't make sense anymore. So private business stopped doing it. But those sharp incentives aren't there for the public sector. You can say, well, somebody else will pay. So they just carry on. Reforming public sector pensions is huge. the NHS needs to be reformed, and nobody likes to talk about it, because, you're supposed to go around with lapel badges saying I heart NHS and all this kind of stuff, but it needs to be reformed. And the NHS will collapse before it's reformed. I feel like I think it will need to completely be on its knees before the politician decides, right, we need to fix this. It needs to be based on a social insurance model, much like a European system. When people talk about reforming the NHS, they get this vision in their head of an American system where, you have the worst of both worlds. You have extremely high premiums, but also high costs for taxpayers, and which leads to people with lots of money having extremely good healthcare and people with not so much money having zero healthcare. Nobody wants that system. Wouldn't want to copy it. Different political culture as much as anything else. But we can look at a European system, something like the Dutch system, where you have insurance providers competing against one another. So there's price mechanisms at play, signals of who provide you the best coverage at the best price. However, you are guaranteed universal coverage, and you are not price discriminated against if you have an underlying condition. So all these things that people throw up as faux concerns are just covered by very well funded, very well run healthcare systems in other European countries. And we see it as this, you can't touch the NHS. It's like, well, we could be like the Dutch, maybe, with better healthcare outcomes, or, like a German system that's more heavily decentralized, so it responds to local healthcare needs. There are loads of ways to do it, that maintain that basic principle of universal coverage. We think we're unique in having universal coverage. We're not at all. We're not special in that regard. So reform. We
just have a brand.
We have an extremely powerful brand. The sort of increase in love for the NHS ties quite neatly with the sort of decline in the church-going people using the Church of England. It's probably not a coincidence. But, dealing with the NHS, dealing with pensions, and then dealing with welfare are the ways, really, that you can get spending under control. And as I mentioned, having a rough target of 33% of GDP for both expenditure and the tax burden, I think is reasonable in a modern, sophisticated social democracy. £1 in every 3 that the economy raises seems fair, and would allow the space for more economic growth, more job creation, and all of the good stuff that we've been talking about.
Are these reforms required before we have tax reform, or can tax reform drive these reforms?
I think tax reform can drive these reforms. Yeah, I do think so, because once you start to see the uptick in economic growth, it allows you a bit more flexibility to make public sector reforms, because when we have a high tax, high spend, poor public service situation, the calls to reform public services are slightly more difficult, because it becomes just about more money is, more money is needed. But, if you're able to reform tax, get economic growth going, start to get debt under control, things of this nature, then you can start to more confidently approach big subjects like reforming the NHS, like getting public sector pensions under control. So I don't think you need to wait, really, in order to start reforming taxes. I think that's something that can happen as quickly as a politician or a leader or a chancellor deigns it to.
So on this podcast, you are definitely hearing me talk about Bitcoin a lot. Well, why? We live in a really strange time with governments driving inflation with their reckless spending and endless money printing. There is a way out of this. There is a way to protect your money, and that is by stacking Bitcoin. I've made loads of shows about Bitcoin. You can go and research this, you can go and read the books, but the truth is, it is the hardest money ever created. If you are interested in protecting your financial future, it's time for you to get on the Bitcoin train. I've been stacking Bitcoin personally and through my businesses since 2017. It's protected me, it's secured my family's future, and it also strengthens all of my businesses. So if you want to start stacking Bitcoin, where do you do it? Well, for me, it's with Gemini. They're a fully licensed, full reserve exchange and custodian, so they give you a secure way for you to buy and own your Bitcoin. There's no risks and no funny business. So if you're serious about stacking Bitcoin the right way, head over to Gemini.com, which is GEMINI.com. The tax code itself is very complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of money I have to spend on accountants across my businesses just to ensure that I am compliant with VAT, personal taxation, corporation tax. I mean, I spend a fortune, not only just in terms of actual costs with my accountants, my own physical time to ensure that we're completely compliant. How would you simplify the tax code?
It's currently, I think it's approaching 25,000 pages. And when George Osborne came in 2010, I think it was more around 11,000 pages.
Okay.
So this is a problem that is completely accelerated at quite a quick pace. This is at the same time as setting up the Office for Tax Simplification as well, which I admired the
Sounds like a joke.
Well, it sounds like a cruel joke. They actually did some good work. It kind of was a bit of window dressing, it seemed like. How do you simplify taxes? Well, you can simplify taxes by abolishing taxes that take up a large percentage of the tax code. So inheritance tax is a key one in this. I might get the specifics wrong, but last time I was looking at this, inheritance tax, I think, makes up over 10% of the tax code, right? For something that brings in somewhere around 8 billion a year in revenue. So not that much in revenue.
Is that all?
Yeah.
Huh.
It's set to increase, but roughly it's about 8 billion. And the reason that it only brings in 8 billion is because it's so riddled with loopholes that
Rich people can get away with it.
But they're the incentives that are put in place for people to, hire accountants, do this, do that, buy farmland, all this kind of stuff that's happened. However, the key way to start simplifying taxes isn't to just sort of say, okay, how can we simplify inheritance tax and start to mess around with the tax code and be fiddly and technical? Just get rid of it. It's by far and away the most unpopular tax to start with, so it would be a popular move. But it would also remove a significant amount away from the tax code. And all of the stuff you've talked about, your time, your accountant's time, that's all brain power and energy that could be used to do something else.
Well, look, I've worked my ass off my whole life. I am a hard-working person. I've worked 10 to 12 hours a day my entire adult life. And my children have paid sacrifices for that in terms of not having time with me sometimes. I've missed things. When I die, the house that I've bought with money I paid tax on, I would like just to leave to them. I don't want to have a scenario where they have to sell the family home to be able to have to pay the tax burden. It feels like a cruel tax, an unfair tax.
You've identified the reason that I think it is the most unpopular tax across the political spectrum. It's left, right. Even we did some polling recently. Even people who vote for the Green Party think it's a bad tax.
Wow.
Right. So the only group that we found that was supportive of inheritance tax are people with PhDs, which might tell you something, very well credentialed people who know better than us maybe. But it's profoundly unpopular. We go on, BBC Question Time. We've been on that show a few times, and it's usually quite a left-wing audience. Mm-hmm. We get a bit of a hard time from the audience in the studio, albeit, people on the TV might think we're talking sense. But the audience in the studio almost always have a pop at us. But the one time where one of our guys got a hearty round of applause is when she said we should abolish inheritance tax. It's profoundly unpopular, and it'd be quite an easy win for a government. We've obviously, the farmers have taken up a hell of a lot of coverage for this, and rightly so.
Well, it felt particularly cruel on them.
Yeah. And the removal of agricultural property relief is seen as a tax simplification that will raise 500 million. It won't raise 500 million because people will find ways around it for starters. But again, it goes back to that Treasury mindset. 500 million to cause so much disruption to not just a business, but a way of life when it comes to farmers. Right. And so they've taken up a lot of the airtime because they've got Clarkson, they've got tractors, they go down to Whitehall. But at the same time, business property relief is being removed as well. And that's for any family-owned business. And you've hit at something when you're explaining your own situation, which is why I think it's so unpopular, is it goes against something really, really visceral, which is I want to leave my children in a better position than I had myself. Or, the things that I work for ought to belong to them.
Well, it feels like theft.
Right.
And I know it's a very libertarian thing to say tax is theft. And I'm not anti-tax. I understand we live in a society. We want, to have a society that functions and that supports people and helps people, the vulnerable in society. But this feels like straight theft. I create a business, I pay corporation tax. I then pay myself, I pay, whether it's a dividend or an income tax. I buy the home which I pay stamp duty to purchase. I've paid enough taxes, multiple taxes, just to be able to get to the hurdle of having this home. It is our family home. When I go, I wanted to stay the family home. Look, if he wants to sell it and buy a Porsche, let him. But it's our family home. They deserve to keep it. It's ours. I'm very much in the field of supporting the property rights here.
I couldn't explain it better myself. I think, and I think that is. You mentioned it's sort of a libertarian argument. As I mentioned, I don't think it is. I think it goes at something quite profound in the human spirit to look after your family, to make sure that there's a home somewhere warm and safe for your family. These are really sort of base instincts that people have, and to come to people at a time of maximum grief and come for 25 or 40% of the estate, I think is profoundly unfair. Yeah, and for a minute slice of government revenue as well, right? 8 billion. It seems trivial, and a trivial amount of money in the bigger picture.
It's less than 1%.
Yes, less than 1% of revenues. Yeah, and then 10% of the tax code or more even. And then how much? And then you go on to other arguments. How much time accountants and economists spend thinking about what the inheritance tax system is, what it looks like, how to best maximize your position when you're handing over your estate, and all that. This is all wasted time and energy. All clever people could be doing something else, and you could be doing something else. You could be opening another business, or spending more time with your family, or whatever else you choose to do. But you're filling out tax forms.
Are there other taxes that you would get rid of?
Stamp duty, land tax. I think it's probably. It's possibly the most damaging tax we have.
Okay.
In terms of efficient allocation of resources, to use the economic terms, but what does it actually mean for people? It means that they can't move to somewhere where there might be better job opportunities. It means that older people can't downsize if they want to. So you get a situation where you get people in their 70s and 80s in 5-bed, 6-bed family houses, probably would be up for selling to a 2-bed bungalow or whatever else, but don't, because of stamp duty. And so you've got this like huge misallocation of resources. It gums up the property market. It itself is now extremely complicated with the different rates that you can pay. I think.
What about a stamp duty on second homes? Do you support that as an idea to protect homes for others?
No, not really. Again, it gums up the market. I get rid of the tax entirely. But if there was going to be stamp duty, an old system, which stamp duty used to be like, of say, call it 1%, 2%, 3% of costs, people might shrug their shoulders and say that's a bit annoying, but you kind of get on with it. But the system we have now of additional rates for second homes, I think it's an additional 3 points for second homes, and you've got top rates of 10, 12%. You're now looking at potential stamp duty rates I saw earlier of 17% on certain purchases. Who's got that kind of cash lying around? So what does it mean? It means that people don't move homes. It means that areas that rely on tourism and people to come and spend money, they suffer as well because people aren't buying second homes.
I'll tell you a funny story. So when I bought my last home, it's like you work your way up the ladder through life. You get that home, the next home. We essentially did a double jump. I found a house that was perfect for us as a family home. The last house I'm going to buy. Beautiful house, out of my budget, just found a way to do it. But the stamp duty cost of that house was the majority of the gains I'd made on my previous house.
Oh, God, yeah. Amazing.
Because when you go to see, you think, I'm going to sell this house, the house price has gone up X, this is great. And then I went to buy this house. I was like, oh, that's all getting eaten up by stamp duty. Yeah. And that felt, I felt like I was being punished.
Yeah. Yeah. For making good decisions to set up a nice family home for your kids to enjoy Christmas or whatever else. Yeah. It's a similar kind of thread of, as you were talking about with inheritance tax, where it's sort of slightly sort of sinister and dark actually when they're coming at you for those kind of things. If taxing flows of income, fine, but purchasing a home for your family, inheritance tax, they feel like much more invasive forms of tax in many ways. Yeah.
So what would a good tax code be? if you got to completely rewrite the tax code, how would you change everything?
People can have a look on our website. The single income tax is our baseline for this, but it would get rid of a whole raft of taxes, and it would be based on taxing, as I mentioned a couple of times, taxing flows of income and only taxing them once. So you'd be looking, Hong Kong has a tax, I was talking about 25,000 pages. Hong Kong has a tax code of around 250 pages.
Wow.
Very simple. They've got extreme, there are niggles and all the rest of it. They've got extremely high property taxes and all this kind of stuff, but it's very simple. And they don't, I think they raise about 20-something% of GDP through their tax system. And the place boomed. Slightly different now that CCP have taken over perhaps, but Hong Kong boomed with low taxes, simple taxes. Because the thing with simple taxes, there's the transparency point, which is an important one. But there's also a stability point. People who invest money like to know what the tax system will look like in 2 or 3 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time. Part of the problem now is that we have politics itself as an entertainment industry infects everything, right? So they have to do 2 fiscal statements a year, a budget where they feel like they have to change taxes to satisfy, the political chat and all of this kind of thing. And what it means in the real economy is that, are they going to move the goalposts again? What should I do with my money? Are they just going to, shift the goalposts next year or their next fiscal statement? So you get this uncertainty with a complicated tax system that you don't with a simple tax system. There are countries. I was talking to somebody from Bulgaria. He was telling me about the tax return he filled out. He logs on. He's got his personal number and all of that, and all the information pops up and populates all of his fields. He just sort of checks it and then clicks submit, because they've got a much simpler tax system, So you get all of these upside benefits of ease and then stability to allow investment in the future. But simple taxes, I've spoken to a few. TPA is based on donations, so we've got quite a few, about 2,000 or 3,000 donors in a given year. A lot of them would prefer simple taxes as a trade-off for 1p more in the pound. If they said 1p more in the pound, but I know what it's going to look like in 15 years' time, I'll take that, just so that they stop messing around with it. I can get on with my business. I know what the costs are, and I can plan accordingly. So simple taxes have a massive upside for people who are involved in business, want to invest in it.
Can you just explain it again, though? When you say these simple taxes, this single stream, what do you actually mean? Is it a single income tax?
A single income tax, of 30%, which is our recommendation.
And everyone pays the same?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what there's no relief if you're...
No, you get rid of that progressive element.
That would feel like people would think it's unpopular.
Yeah, I can see that. However, the trade-off is that there's transparency.
But if you're a lower tax...
There would be a generous allowance.
Okay, so you start with a generous allowance.
Yeah, with a flatter tax system, they almost always ought to have quite a high personal tax allowance for the very reasons you're talking about.
Okay.
And if you earn twice as much, you pay twice as much. It's based on some quite simple principles.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't get the situation that we have now, which is the temptation for politicians to freeze higher rates of tax and the thresholds so that you have people on, very reasonable, modest jobs paying tax rates intended for rich. So you've got people like, hairdressers, policemen, nurses now paying rates of tax at 40%.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Which is absolutely crazy. So the problem with having that progressive structure is that it creates that incentive for politicians to drag more and more people into it to increase revenues. But if you keep things proportionate, you remove that incentive.
And would you still have corporation taxes?
No, they'd be wrapped into this single tax. So it'd be
literally one income tax.
Yeah, for business and for individuals.
There's no other tax in society. One single income tax, and that's it.
There'd be VAT.
Okay. Should that be reformed in any way? It's a tough tax on certain businesses.
It's a really tough tax.
And where it's a tough tax? Coffee shops.
Yeah.
I don't pay VAT on the coffee beans I buy. Okay, so I don't claim VAT back. So if I buy a kilogram of coffee, it's £20, it's £20. But I make the cup of coffee and I have to give 20% of the cup of coffee back. It's a very tough tax on businesses like that.
Yeah, it is. And again,
I don't mind a sales tax as
Yeah.
such, but I would rather a flat rate sales tax.
Mhm.
It's just a percentage across everything.
right. So you've hit on an important point, because I think the problem with VAT is so complicated. It makes inheritance tax look like child's play. It's so complicated. There's so many different exemptions and zero rates that it means that the rate overall is jacked up, because there's so many things that are exempt that in order to keep revenues where they are, they have to jack up the rate for everyone else. And then, the complications, is it hot food? Is it cold food? Is it a pie? Is it a pasty? Is it a Jaffa cake? Is it a biscuit? This is mental. Is it a gingerbread man with chocolate pieces or no chocolate pieces? These are genuine things.
Did they have it in or take away?
Right, exactly. These are all things that people have to think about, which is totally nuts. In an ideal world, what you want is a system, as you described, which is, I don't know what the number is. Let's call it 10%. 10% on everything. Now, the problem with that is that the things that are zero rated currently are things like children's clothing,
Water.
which, I talk about politicians being braver. Like, I don't think even I would want to go in there and say, I'm slapping taxes on children's clothing. It's very, very difficult. But that's the problem that that politicians create with all of these carve-outs and caving into special interests, and special interests actually identifying the use of the tax system to pursue ends like social justice. The tax system should be neutral on whatever you do. It should be about chipping in for public services. It shouldn't favor you if you carry out one type of business over another. It should be neutral in that decision-making process. It should have no part to play. So the VAT system, in theory, ought to be the same, albeit, who's the politicians that's going to stand up and say, I'm putting VAT on children's clothing? But the other thing with a sales tax, of course, if you go to the States, they add it at the till. And so the price you see on the shelf is different to the one you pay at the till. I think it's quite an important thing for like a psychological thing. People start to appreciate, hang on a minute, that's the difference. Whereas in the UK, we've got PAYE and VAT. You're sort of numb to, which again is why something like council tax is so profoundly unpopular, because you have to pay it with post-tax income. I've got to actually, write this bill or write this check to the council or whatever. So having to pay the sales tax at the till, we've done some campaigns in the past on alcohol duties and fuel duty, where we've gone to petrol forecourts and pubs, and we've had sort of point of sale signs to show people how much tax they're paying. On beer duty, it's around a third, or at least it was when we did the campaign, it's around a third of the cost of the pint. At the pump, it can be upwards of 60% of the cost, right? Which is, I think, at the moment, the second highest in Europe. It fluctuates depending on oil prices and all these kind of things. But having that point of sale information for people really does start to change mindsets. We sent beer mats out around the country. Weatherspoons actually were kind enough to send them around the country for us. And they had a little QR code and all of this kind of stuff. But it was a picture of a pint. A third of it was red. This is how much you're sending to the tax man. So arming people with that information at the till, I think is really important. Starts to sharpens people's mind to the fact that these costs are significant.
And if it was a single income tax, what would be classed as income? How would you ensure that? What are the loopholes of people trying to get away? It doesn't matter whether it's dividend. Is it anything that comes to you from a business?
Pretty much.
Any
pay, dividend, distribution from a company. Yeah, it'd be taxed at the same rate.
Yeah.
So you start to get rid of some of that distinction between, is it unfair that people pay themselves in dividends and not income and all this kind of stuff? All of that goes away.
Stop looking for loopholes. I like it.
Yeah, you stop looking for loopholes and you start thinking about ways to expand your business,
Exactly.
Take on more work, do more in your life, spend more leisure time if you want, whatever you so wish, but worrying less and thinking less about how to get, maximize my revenue out of a very complicated tax system.
HMRC would become a lot smaller as well.
It ought to. I'd like to see, I think it's got 80,000 employees. I'll apologies if I got that wrong, but I think it's somewhere in that region. It's absolutely extraordinary.
With good pensions.
With good pensions. and working from home a lot and not answering the phones and all of that other stuff that they put taxpayers through. We've seen some cases recently of people's lives being turned upside down, like incorrectly, but from an incorrect HMRC decision. So they can really use some quite powerful forces against individuals and businesses. And again, you get this idea that if you are a big multinational corporation, you can sit down with them and they'll sort out what your tax rate's going to be for the year, but not for you. You know?
I like it. Are any countries doing this that you've proposed?
Do you know what? It's Estonia is still seen as, from somebody from my perspective, from my view of the world, Estonia is still seen as a very simple, very clean, very efficient tax system. We took a fair amount of inspiration from the Estonian system in our work. I suppose one of the benefits of the post-Soviet economies is they genuinely had almost a literal blank sheet of paper to work from, because they were, rising from the sort of post-Soviet ashes, as it were. So they were able to design things from first principles. And I think he was the first Estonian president, a guy called Mart Laar. He was a history teacher, and he said, I didn't really know about economics or finance. I just saw this recommended somewhere and thought it was a good idea, so I just did it. And you're like, well, yeah, seemed to work out all right, didn't it?
So what stops this happening then?
Vested interests, public spending. It is all about spending. And the Westminster debate, again, is how do we pay for it rather than why are we spending it? And if we address that first question, we'll be in a much healthier place.
Is there anything I've not asked you yet that you wish we'd have covered on this?
Not really, I suppose. I think we've covered a fair amount in what's felt like a short space of time.
About an hour and a half.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
Is if people want to support you, how do they support you?
TaxPayersalliance.com. They can sign up to our weekly bulletin for free. And financial support, there's a donate button on the website. We've got people who support us with £10 a year, £10 a month, and some slightly larger donors as well. We probably raise somewhere around 850, 900,000 a year.
Right.
So we're quite a lean team. We like to practice what we preach. We've got a small team in the office who work their socks off, and lots of volunteers around the country as well who help us on local action days and all of these kinds of things. So we feel like there's a whole voice out there of busy people, people who are running businesses, raising families and all this kind of stuff, who don't necessarily have the time to get involved in the political debate in the same way that people on the left do, who have
plenty of time
on their hands usually, or certainly a lot more than busy people. But there does feel to me at the moment, I think people are now, you're seeing it with the farmers out on the street, and I saw a protest from people who own salons the other day. People feel like enough's enough now.
Enough is enough.
Enough is enough. Like, you're coming after us on literally every single, when you fly, when you drive, when you pay an electricity bill, when you're buying a home, every aspect of your life, buying a pint, buying something in the shop, everything is taxed. Everything is taxed, and people just feel like, do you know what? We've had enough of that.
Yeah. Well, listen, look, thank you for coping with me with my voice. Anyone listening, I probably sound very different today, but I'm glad we did this, and we should probably do it again sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for bearing with my voice. We'll see you soon.